Last year, at this time, we spent 10 weeks, making sure all my animations work, looking at Los Angeles as a beginning mythology student might. We looked at stories of creation, heroes, tricksters, and apocalypse, among others. This year, we look deeper into the City of Angels, using its literary lights to reveal even more layers of myth and meaning. This approach is especially useful because it reflects the nature of the city itself, one made of many voices from many times that contribute to a city that is virtually uninterpretable. I'm not the only one to say this, which produces in itself more interpretations. Over the next 10 weeks, we'll explore some of these meanings and interpretations of the City of Angels, beginning with what I think is Los Angeles' creation myth, Ramona by Helen Hunt Jackson. In his essential and fascinating account of Southern California, which you must read if you want to know anything about California, published in 1946, Carrie McWilliams writes, "Someday the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce should erect a great bronze statue of Helen Hunt Jackson at the entrance to the Cajon Pass." You heard that, right? Okay.
It's just coming
around. I know. I knew he was going to be pissed at me. Yeah. Let's start over. In his essential and fascinating account of Southern California, Carrie McWilliams writes, "Someday the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce should erect a great bronze statue of Helen Hunt Jackson at the entrance to the Cajon Pass. Beneath the statue should be inscribed no flowery dedication, but the simple inscription, HH in gratitude. For little," quoting, "for little plump, fair-skinned, blue-eyed Helen Hunt Jackson, or HH, as she was known to every resident of Southern California, was almost solely responsible for the evocation of Southern California's mission past. And it was she who catapulted the lowly digger Indian of Southern California into the Empyrean." I would add to McWilliams' assessment of HH's impact on Southern California and Los Angeles that Ramona is the creation story of Los Angeles, and an accidental one, as you'll see. So let's explore this amazing story and the story of its reception in Southern California. So there she is. Born Helen Maria Fisk, October 15th, 1830, Amherst, Massachusetts. Her friend and neighbor was none other than Emily Dickinson, and they stayed friends throughout their lives. She marries Edward Bissell Hunt in 1852, and he didn't last very long, so she later marries William Sharpless Jackson. Sharpless. Just going to leave that there. She published A Century of Dishonor in 1881. And if you've ever done any Native American studies, you will know this book. It's an indictment of, a kind of ethnographic indictment of the United States treatment of its native peoples. Then she goes, because of this book, she goes on an expedition with Abbot Kinney, right? To explore, who was a fascinating person in his own right, to explore the native peoples of Southern California. And from that emerges Ramona, the novel, in 1884. So, the novel is basically in two parts. Part one is Senora Moreno's rancho, and things happen there that we will talk about. And it's actually this least interesting part in some ways, at least in terms of plot and action, that has the effect upon Southern California of the creation myth that I was talking about. We'll get into all this. So it's Senora Moreno and her son Felipe. And let me just give you a taste of this. I want you to get a taste of the novel throughout. It's Raymond Chandler, I forget what he called it, but he was not pleased with this novel. I think he called it sentimental slop. But we have an old history of that. You know, Nathaniel Hawthorne was so upset with the popularity of Uncle Tom's Cabin that he wrote to his publisher about these damned scribbling women, right? So male writers have often welcomed female writers into the guild. But here's the voice. You heard that, right? Okay. Here's the voice. It's going to be a weird night, isn't it? Already, okay. Here's the voice of Helen Hunt Jackson in the novel. I think in terms of style, it's well done. Objections come to the genre, really, of the work is sentimental fiction, but we'll get to that. But listen to this language. The Senora Moreno's house was one of the best specimens to be found in California of the representative house of half-barbaric, half-elegant, wholly generous, and free-handed life led there by Mexican men and women of degree in the early part of the century. In the early part of the century, under the rule of the Spanish and Mexican viceroys, when the laws of the Indies were still the law of the land, and its old name, New Spain, was an ever-present link and stimulus to the warmest memories and deepest patriotisms of its people. It was a picturesque life, with more of sentiment and gaiety in it, more also that it was truly dramatic, more romance than will ever be seen again on these sunny shores. The aroma of it all still lingers there. Industries and inventions have not yet slain it. It will last out its century. In fact, it can never be quite lost, so long as there is left standing one such house as Senora Moreno's. Okay. Part 2 is a journey novel, or part of the novel is journey, and it involves two of the main characters, Ramona, who is Scottish, of Scottish ancestry and native. She's also orphaned. Her mother dies, and Senora Moreno takes her under her wing to care for her, but does not like her. And then there is Alessandro, who is Luceño and falls in love with Ramona. Here, again, Helen Hunt Jackson's voice regarding Ramona. There was also Ramona. Ramona was, to the world at large, a far more important person than the Senora herself. The Senora was of the past. Ramona was of the present. For one eye that could see the significant, at times solemn beauty of Senora's pale and shadowed countenance, there were 100 that flashed with eager pleasure at the barest glimpse of Ramona's face. The shepherds, the herdsmen, the maids, the babies, the dogs, the poultry, all loved the sight of Ramona. All loved her except the Senora. The Senora loved her not, never had loved her, never could love her, and yet she stood in the place of mother to the girl ever since her childhood, and never once during the whole 16 years of her life had shown her any unkindness in act. She had promised to be a mother to her, and with all the inalienable staunchness of her nature, she fulfilled the letter of her promise. More than the bond lay in the bond, but that was not the Senora's fault. Here's another depiction of Ramona, and you will recognize the racist overtones, of course, that were common in the 19th century, not to mention the sexist ones. A man must be dead not to thrill at it. Ramona had just enough of olive tint in her complexion to underlie and enrich her skin without making it swarthy. Her hair was like her Indian mother's, heavy and black, but her eyes were like her father's, steel blue. Alessandro himself is also beautiful. He's the son of the chief, and also he's a Luceño, but also a devout Catholic. Here is a depiction of Alessandro. The sunset beams played around her hair like a halo. The whole place was aglow with red light, and her face was kindled into transcendent beauty. That's Ramona. A sound arrested her attention. She looked up. Forms, dusky black against the fiery western sky, were coming down the valley. It was a band of Indian shearers. This is how the novel opens. It's sheep shearing time. And they're waiting for the Luciño to come because they are the sheep shearers. They turned to the left and went towards the sheep sheds and booths, but there was one of them that Ramona did not see. He'd been standing for some minutes concealed behind a large willow tree a few rods from the place where Ramona was kneeling. It was Alessandro, son of Pablo Assis, captain of the shearing band. Walking slowly along in advance of his men, he had felt a light, as if from a mirror held in the sun, smite his eyes. It was the red sunbeam on the glittering water where Ramona knelt. In the same second, he saw Ramona. He halted, as wild creatures of the forest halt at a sound, gazed, walked abruptly from his men who kept on, not noticing his disappearance. Cautiously, he moved a few steps nearer into the shelter of a gnarled old willow, from behind which he could gaze unperceived on the beautiful vision, for so it seemed to him. As he gazed, his senses seemed to be leaving him, and unconsciously he spoke aloud, "Christ, what shall I do?" This is why it's a romance. Alessandro quickly falls in love. He's already in love. He's done right there already, first glance. Falls in love with Ramona, agrees to stay on at the rancho. Ramona falls in love with him, and Senora Moreno is outraged. This is an old story, right? And although Ramona is half Native American, the Senora does not want her to marry a Native American. Again, another old story. Ramona realizes that Senora Moreno has never loved her, and she and Alessandro elope. This angers the Senora, who hated Indians and had never told Ramona of her ancestry, so she locked her up and threatened to send her to a nunnery. Felipe Moreno, the Senora's son, tries to intervene, but to no avail. And so she locks up Ramona rather than have her marry Alessandro. You know what happens. Of course, they elope and get married in San Diego, and then they flee to Alessandro's village in Temecula. But Temecula has been colonized. The Americans are there, and everything is gone. And Alessandro's people are evicted from their home. Right. So this begins the Odyssey part of the novel, where they are running for their lives, quite literally. So they end up in San Pasquale, where some of the Temecula band had reassembled, and Ramona gives birth to a blue-eyed daughter named Eyes of the Sky. This is a romance, right? Eyes of the Sky. And the couple experienced a brief period of domestic happiness, but everywhere are the encroaching Americans. They're tearing up the ranchos, and they're tearing up the native lands, of course. And of course, Eyes of the Sky falls ill, as many babies did in the 19th century. But this was because the Indian agency doctor refused to make the 30-mile trip to Saboba, where they were staying. And so the baby dies because of neglect by the Indian agent. They keep fleeing to remoter and remoter venues and valleys. San Jacinto, and this is where we get the quote from on the Eventbrite page on our marketing, is where they go up into the mountains there and they see this valley and they're overcome, and Ramona thinks they will finally be at peace. In fact, she says, at last, Alessandro, Here we are safe. This is freedom. This is joy. But of course, we know better because this is a tragic romance. And Alessandro begins to decompensate, as we used to say when I worked at the mental health center. He begins to lose his mind, basically. He has these episodes where he's hallucinating, basically. And it gets worse and worse, and ultimately it leads to his death because in one of these episodes, he takes a white man's horse, thinking it is his, and heads off to San Jacinto with it, and the white man, of course, shoots him. Felipe reappears, you might have seen this coming, to find Ramona, marry her, and take her to Mexico, where it's more civilized. So that is the plot of the novel, but I wanted to give you this sense of Jackson's depiction of Alessandro's decompensation, because I think it's, from what I've read of native anthropology and archaeology and literature, this is about right. There was no real healing for Alessandro. His hurts had gone too deep. His passionate heart ever secretly brooding on the wrongs he had borne, the hopeless outlook for his people in the future, and most of all on the probable destitution and suffering in store for Ramona, consumed itself as if by hidden fires. Speech, complaint, active activism might have saved him, but all these were foreign to his self-contained, reticent, and repressed nature. Slowly, so slowly that Ramona could not tell on what hour or what day her terrible fears first changed to an even more terrible certainty, his brain gave way. And the thing, in dread of which he had cried out the morning they left San Pasquale, came upon him. Strangely enough and mercifully now that it had really come, he did not know it. He knew that he suddenly came to his consciousness sometimes and discovered himself in strange and unexplained situations, had no recollection of what had happened for an interval of time, longer or shorter, but he thought it was only a sort of sickness. He did not know that during these intervals, his acts were the acts of a madman, never violent, aggressive, or harmful to anyone, never destructive. It was piteous to see how in these intervals, his delusions were always shaped by the bitterest experiences of his life. And sometimes he fancied that the Americans were pursuing him, or that they were carrying off Ramona and he was pursuing them. At such times, he would run with maniac swiftness for hours till he fell exhausted on the ground and slowly regained true consciousness by exhaustion. At other times, he believed he owned vast flocks and herds and would enter any enclosure he saw where there were sheep or cattle and go about among them, speaking of them to passers-by as his own. We talked about Leslie Marmon Silko the last time I was up here. I heard her say about living the life of an indigenous person, first they make you crazy, then they shoot you. And that happened to be true, and I was with her because there had been a Native person on the freeway in Tucson, or Phoenix, I forget. And he wasn't threatening, he had no gun, he was just out of his mind. And they shot him. This was years ago, but I'm sure I wouldn't have to go very far back to find another incident like that. First they make you crazy, then they shoot you. All right, so how did this novel come about? The Making of Ramona. First of all, we have Helen Hunt Jackson's travels in California in 1872. And then she eventually went to Colorado, where she made her home. And she saw and said on that trip that Native people were in worse shape than the slave. Okay, well, that's arguable, but her point is they're in bad shape, right? She hears a man named Standing Bear in Boston in 1879. He's lecturing on the loss of Indian lands. And 1879 is a really interesting time, by the way. It's only a couple decades before the Wounded Knee Massacre. And she later met up with Standing Bear and his companion, Bright Eyes, and they met in New York, and she suddenly became very, very interested in the plight of Native people. These people, Standing Bear, are Poncas, so they're Plains Indians. But she ends up in California, and, well, she actually ends up in the library in New York, the Astor Library, where she does her research for A Century of Dishonor. So that appears in 1881, where she's not doing field work. She's sitting in the library reading these accounts of Native peoples, usually from missionaries or cavalrymen. Yeah, she purchased at her own expense a copy for each member of Congress and made sure that every representative and senator got a copy. Nothing really happened except that they do what bureaucrats usually do. They give her something to keep her busy. And so that's how the Abbott-Kinney expedition emerged in 1882, 1 year after the publication of A Century of Dishonor, which is called Report on the Condition and Needs of the Mission Indians of California, made by Special Agents Helen, Jackson, and Abbott-Kinney to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, sent from Colorado Springs, Colorado on July 13th, 1883. I love those 19th century titles. All right. So from that, she's now no longer in the library. She's seeing Native life up close. And that prompts her to go beyond the report, which is a government report, to creating what she called her own Uncle Tom's Cabin. She says that she would be happy if Ramona would do for the Indian 1,000th part of what Uncle Tom's Cabin did for the Negro. And of course, you may not know this, but Uncle Tom's Cabin, it was significant. It was very influential in the Civil War. And in fact, Abraham Lincoln, when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, said, "Oh, so you're the little lady who started this war." It was impactful. It sold volumes and volumes. And people didn't really know about the horrors of slavery. People outside the South, or in certain sections of the South even, didn't know. But Stowe had dramatized it in terms of family relations in a way that just was so compelling that it lit the cause of abolition. And Jackson wanted to do this for Native people, especially in California. So this is sentimental fiction, as it's called. It's too easily dismissed because it's actually men started writing sentimental fiction in the 19th century, but it's usually associated with women. And it would be a mistake to underestimate its influence. I remember in my first doctoral seminar, we're sitting around and we're talking about stuff, and it's supposed to be high-minded. And I remember this woman saying that she read Cosmopolitan, and we were all like, "Oh, how dare you betray the sisterhood," and blah, blah, blah. And she's like, "Look, it's the language that I know. It's the language that speaks to me. I can see what's happening here, but," she said, "I would say it's no different from men reading sports tales and stuff, or war stories or whatever. It's my language. I recognize it." I'll never forgotten that. And of course, that's been the consensus too of scholars who study this sentimental fiction. Jane Tompkins, for example, says that these women writers, Stowe, Jackson, others, should be understood as their work should be understood as a political enterprise halfway between sermon and social theory that both codifies and attempts to mold the values of its time. Well, that's exactly what Jackson was doing, exactly, several decades after Uncle Tom's Cabin. All right, the remaking of Ramona. I hope you can see that stamp, an actual stamp from Ramona's marriage place. So, a post office after Ramona's marriage place. And it was a novel. So there is no place except in your mind. Early reviews were good. In 1885, reviewer writes that in Ramona, Jackson had, quote, successfully welded together the aims of novelist and reformer, unquote. Jackson must have loved that. Another one, Ramona has done for the American Indians what Ms. Stowe has, sorry, it wasn't Ms. back then, Mrs. Stowe has done for the slaves. Ah, well, there it is. I love this one. 1889, Grace Adele Pierre, reviewing the novel, says, in relation to Uncle Tom's Cabin, that Jackson had dipped her pen in the reddest of her heart's blood and wrote, the result we hold as one of the nation's grandest possessions. Similarly, Jackson was imbued with an honest purpose, another reviewer says. No work of human genius could ever have touched the universal heart as these two works had done. So it worked at the beginning. And then, those are the early reviews, and then not much later, the story becomes real. Here's what I mean. This is from an article in California History. Even those who claim to understand that Ramona was a work of fiction lost track of the boundaries between the book's story and the reality it purported to describe. That's from an article called Social Problem Novel as Tourist Guide. Great title. And in fact, this is exactly what happened. This is Carrie McWilliams again. When the book was first published, it provoked a storm of protest in the Southland. Egged on by various civic groups, the local critics denounced it as a tissue of falsehoods, a travesty on history, a damnable libel on Southern California. But the book was perfectly timed, McWilliams notes, providentially timed, to coincide with the great invasion of homeseekers and tourists to the region. As these hordes of winter tourists began to express a lively interest in visiting Ramona's land, Southern California experienced an immediate change of attitude and overnight became passionately Ramona conscious. Beginning in about 1887, a Ramona promotion of fantastic proportions began to be organized in the region. End of quote. And in fact, the literary enterprise got in on this. So as early as 1886, a San Francisco Chronicle article by Edward Roberts was later added to the novel itself as an afterword. Now, this is a novel. Sure, she based the novel on her experiences, but every novel is based on an experience, you know? So Roberts' article was among the first of many about the real Ramona and the real Senora Moreno. And the publisher saw the potential here and latched onto it. And so began advertising, marketing the novel as a kind of popular anthropology, reading the novel as a true history of a real people, exotic but not remote. That's the key. Exotic but not remote. You don't have to go far to find them, this exoticism. And you can visit in lovely Southern California, where the weather is perfect and everybody's healthy. This addition to the novel, or a paratext, set the stage for future travel-oriented introductions while driving and embracing the new phenomenon of Ramona travel and travel narratives. The 1900 Monterey edition is, in fact, a travelogue. It published it as a travelogue under the pen name Susan Coolidge, who emphasizes her role as friend of Helen Hunt Jackson. And then more and more of these get layered on. And in 1913, there is a traveler's edition of Ramona. Of course there is. Why wouldn't you go there? People are coming to see a fictional landscape. Give it to them. And they did. They did. The traveler's edition of Ramona. And then, of course, there were promotions. So when McWilliams says that this was providential, he's not kidding, because this was the time of the arrival of the railroads in Los Angeles. As you know, the railroads, Transcontinental Railroad ended up first in San Francisco. But by the late 19th century, right around the publication, well, right around the Ramona craze, the railroads arrive in Los Angeles. And they start having a fare war. This is well documented in Los Angeles history, that much of Los Angeles' population is from Iowa, because you could get a ticket from Iowa to Los Angeles for $1. $1. And plus, you add that to the Chamber of Commerce's booster, I almost said propaganda or marketing, whatever, where you could come to California and you'd be cured of everything. And the vegetables were 10 times bigger than you'd ever seen. And it was basically Eden. And so you add that with Ramona, who tells this romantic tale of a people who were great, but thank God they're gone, right? So we can have nostalgia about them without them actually being in front of us, right? No wonder that LA grew the way it did. No wonder Ramona became its creation myth. So McWilliams says, and again, he's writing in 1946, so a lot of this is within the memory of the people he knows. And he says this, that throughout Southern California homes, you would often see verses framed in the living room. And the verses were these: "There, with her dimpled, lifted hands, parting the mustard's golden plumes, the dusky maid Ramona stands amid the sea of blooms. And Alessandro, type of all his broken tribe, forevermore in exile, hears the stranger call within his father's door." In the living room, over the hearth. Well, while Jackson is certainly trading in Native American mythology in the sense of white perceptions and constructions of Native people, she is also doing something that is arguably more damaging. Some people argue it. I don't think I would, but still. And that is the creation of the mission myth. The mission myth. What is that? And I'm using myth here as both falsehood and story that is enacted in the world. So in both senses of myth. And that is that, okay, so you know this was, Southern California was Spanish, and then it became Mexican, and then the Americans came in after the well, they came in before that, but they took possession after the Mexican-American War. So this imagined golden age of the Spanish, the Californios they were called, though they never called themselves that. They were old Spanish families. And this notion that everything was beautiful and elegant and perfect, or if it's not perfect, it's pretty damn good. And you know, all this stuff that we're dealing with now, we didn't have to deal with back then, because the Spanish, they had it figured out. And of course, the main representation of Spanish influence in California is the missions, right? That's it. This is Gertrude Atherton, writing in the middle of the 19th century, describing the opposite, I should say, the opposite of the mission myth. Here's a woman writing not to promote the mission myth, but just based on her experience growing up near one. "Looked at with the cold eye of one indifferent to material, It is doubtful if there is any structure on earth colder, barer, uglier, dirtier, less picturesque, less romantic than a California mission. So cheap are they, so tawdry, so indescribably common, so suggestive of mules harbored within, and chattering, unshorn priests, and dirty Mexicans with their unspeakable young. There is none of the mellowness, nor any of the beautiful stains of age on their glaring adobe walls. Nothing but whitewash, blistered, or peeling, off in patches, which makes them look as if afflicted with a species of architectural leprosy. This drives McWilliams crazy. He hates this. He keeps mentioning it throughout the book. Such Indians, he says, as Alessandro, were never seen upon this earth. Furthermore, the story extolled the Franciscans in the most extravagant manner and placed the entire onus of the mistreatment of the Indians with the noisy and vulgar gringos. At the same time, the sad plight of Ramona and Alessandro got curiously mixed up in the telling with the plight of the, quote, fine old Spanish families, unquote, among the most flagrant exploiters of the Indian in Southern California. Indeed, he's right that it is odd that the Franciscans would be valorized in this way when if you wanted to make, I was going to say make a hero, but if you want to not make a villain out of Catholic intrusion into Southern California, you might pick the Jesuits, who were here first and then became too powerful, and so they were replaced by the Franciscans, who were horrible to the native people, responsible for many deaths, many venereal diseases, all kinds of things. They were terrible. McWilliams would like you to know that he knew of Indians in Los Angeles, and this is what he says. One must turn to the local annals to select more appropriate symbols. There is, for example, the character Polonia, an Indian of great stature and strength, whose eyes had been burned out of their sockets. Clad in a tattered blanket, this blind Indian was a familiar figure on the dusty streets of Los Angeles in the 50s and 60s. That's the 1850s and 60s. And there was Viejo Cholo, or old half-breed, who wore a pair of linen pantaloons and used a sheet for a mantle. His cane was a broom handle, his lunch counter the swill basket. Viejo Cholo was succeeded as the principal Indian eccentric of Los Angeles by another half-breed, Pinicati, a tiny man. Pinicati was only 4 feet in height, badly pockmarked. He had a flat nose and a stubby beard. He was generally attired in a well-worn straw hat, the top of which was missing, and his long straight hair stuck out in clumps and snarls. He goes on. So this is the shocking comparison of two stories. Of the Indians of Southern California, most of whom were murdered or died as a result of illness that they had never seen before, and most of whom disappeared. Now, there are plenty of Native people still in California, but there are whole tribes that are gone, just gone, okay? So if you were going to make a myth, why would you choose this one? Because it's so horrendous, right? To erase it, to layer it over with a better story, a story that assuages your guilt, if you have any, and promises a California that was once a golden age and now has fallen away. But we can get back to it. That's the story. That's the meaning of every golden age story, is that you can get back to it. So don't despair. We just need to do X, Y, and Z, which usually involves removing people like A, B, and C. The anthropologist Renato Rosaldo calls this Imperialist Nostalgia, which traffics in, of course, the myth of the noble savage, first created by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but applied very heavily to white writers in the 19th century and the 20th century in regard to native people. Noble savages which is an improvement somewhat upon savages, which is what they were before. But this imperialist nostalgia is a problematic longing and valorization of Native people and Californios who are both gone, right? So that also is very convenient if they're gone, or if you perceive that they're gone. Ramona brought new tourists to California, aided by a See America First patriotic tourism campaign and low railroad fares. And due to demand, proprietors had shifted their already existing tourist sites to accommodate Ramona-themed tourism by the mid-1920s. There is also a theater of sentiment here that we enjoy to this day. A theater of sentiment in which we learn to identify a place and a sensibility. We do this all the time. We still do this all the time. When I talk about Los Angeles to my friends back east, and I love saying back east because it's, back there, go back there. It is with this sense of place and sensibility, which is nice and okay, except when it becomes deadly. It is an effective landscape, a landscape that evokes your feelings, right? That evokes, and those feelings get connected to a sense of place. Sandra Sprayberry says, when language touches land, place is created. When language touches land, place is created. That's brilliant. That's exactly what happened here. Language, this novel that was meant to be a protest novel, and Jackson used the literary conventions she knew, especially those she modeled on Uncle Tom's Cabin, to produce a better life for the native people of Southern California. And then this is what happened. What she created was the raw material for a theater of sentiment, where you can come here and live in a different world. You can examine that world from a safe distance, like every tourist, or almost every tourist. You can examine it from a safe distance, right? You get to see, oh, look, and you get to cathect your feelings. Oh, that poor native boy, right? And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that's how this worked. That's the Ramona myth. And so the Ramona industry now begins. Sightseeing, guidebooks, as we already saw, tourist sites began to shift from one place to another to accommodate the imaginary geography of the novel, including George Wharton James in 1908. This is the famous Ramona reality project, where he tries to track down every place in the novel. Now, I know that sounds silly, but I've done stuff like that, right? You probably have you've probably gone to Bukowski's liquor store over on Western, right? Sure, of course you have. I do this all the time. And let me tell you, academics and English professors are the worst for it. We're the worst. We will fawn in front of a famous author. I've seen it. I might even have done it. All right, so tourists search for the real Ramona, promised to them in the tourist literature. And though they were often met by people seeking to make a quick buck, including, well, a woman who gets caught up in this by the name of Ramona Lubo. You saw her picture at the beginning. She had read about, Jackson had read about Ramona Lubo, and in fact, the circumstances of her life are somewhat similar to Ramona's in that her husband is killed by a white man, but otherwise there's no similarity. But she begins Ramona Lubo starts charging small fees for tourists to take pictures of her with their brand new Kodak cameras, or for entrepreneurs to take pictures of her to reproduce in postcards. She received no royalties for the latter. And in fact, newspapers denounced her opportunism. Her opportunism. Ramona. And then, of course, there's the first film of Ramona, done in 1910 by none other than D.W. Griffith. I'll just play a little bit of it for you here. Many of you will know about the Ramona pageant, held in Hemet since 1923. Anybody know where Hemet is? Yeah. So it's been going since 1923. Actually, it's been going since earlier than that, but it was dramatized by a man named Garnet Holm, and first began it formally in 1923 and becoming an annual event now. And it relates to the mission plays that went on in Southern California about the same time, where the missions again were valorized as the golden ages of California for everyone, right? Especially for Native people who were cared for and treated with respect and dignity. The mission plays began in the mid-30s in San Gabriel. All right, and then, this actually has become a Southern California ritual. I mean, I know we don't see many rituals at work now, but this is one. Just ask anybody who's been there. I've never been there, but I've talked to people who have. And this is a thing. But then, you can't let a story just never lasts, right? It's got to keep emerging. It's got to keep changing. A story is protean. It's not a rock. It's constantly transforming itself. And so this myth now gets reinterpreted, and I love this. One of the first big changes to the play was the introduction of Spanish into the script. What? A story about Southern California in 1884 that uses Spanish? And the more and more inclusion of Native people, representations of the tribe. In fact, there is now Native American sponsorship of the Ramona play in Hemet. I love this line, though. Let me see if I can find it. In fact, this one scholar says, a local participant says that without the help of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, the pageant would have gone belly up. And then there is, early as 1927, there was criticism of the play from a woman named Candido Hopkins, a man named Candido Hopkins, the son of Ramona Luba, who writes, although the pageant is supposed to be in the honor of the Indian woman who was immortalized in Miss Jackson's famous story, it is well known that it is primarily a publicity scheme on the part of the real estate interests in your locality. In view of the fact that her name is thus commercialized, with the proceeds of this exhibition netting thousands of dollars each season, it would seem to me that it would be no more than right and proper for her heirs to share in the receipts. And this is a woman who's quoting someone she interviewed. A Native American former pageanteer told me that she still hasn't decided whether the pageant can bring awareness to Native American issues and be a viable social critique, even after a lifetime of attending the event and 7 years in participating as one of the singers. So what's the modern meaning? We don't know. What is the modern meaning? Why would you go to the Ramona pageant? I think it's probably, we'll talk about that in a minute. In 2015, the Ramona Pageant Board of Directors commissioned an Idlewild local, Stephen Savage, to write a new version of the play. Unlike the Garnet Holm version, and unlike Jackson's book, this version keeps Ramona and Felipe in California at the rancho that they both love. The story must change. Rather than recognize the changing times and the tragedy that has befallen them both, Ramona seems to overcome the tragedy, making the play into a narrative romance. She ends the play with the following words, Ramona does, this new play: "My home, California, where everyone can receive justice." All right. Ramona's reflection and culture, and then we'll wrap this up and I'll let you get in. Obviously, place names. You've probably seen Ramona towns and villages and restaurants and all kinds of things around. Ramona produced a renaissance in mission revival architecture. And so beginning in the 1880s and continuing through the early 20th century, new construction often opted for mission revival architecture. You may have seen some of this in train stations and other places. And of course, it was good for real estate promotion. Those of you who grew up here probably know that the missions are a part of elementary education in California. Is it fourth grade? Fourth grade, where this is required. You will not be surprised that the state's instructional materials on the missions have changed over the years. Initially, of course, the Indians were portrayed as abysmally ignorant and primitive in their native state, but rise to their humanity thanks to the Jesuits and Franciscans who run the missions. According to, Lola B. Hoffman, California Beginnings, published by the California State Department of Education, the missions are the romantic period in the history of the state, which began with the founding of the first mission at San Diego. The romantic period, see, there it is, there's the move. It was one of the most tragic, horrific times for Native people of California, but we romance it. And we do it through elementary education, among other things. According to Hoffman, the text read that everyone in the mission era was happy and busy. Well, as you can probably tell, this is constantly evolving now. And I don't know much about what's being taught now, but I do know that there is an emphasis on the Native people now. Maybe you can enlighten me on that in just a minute. Of course, greed. Romancing the missions was good business for many Californians. Again, according to McWilliams, the mission myth was the product of a conspiracy of land developers, chambers of commerce, and the railroads. And Helen Hunt Jackson gave them the perfect product to sell. They promoted for economic self-interest, to boost tourism, to sell real estate. McWilliams argues that the deeply rooted attachment to the word mission, with all its connotations, is largely traceable to the diligence with which early Los Angeles realtors propagated romantic notions concerning the historical background of Southern California. no less than Hollywood, is a real estate development that we turned into a cultural product. It used to be, you know this, it used to be Hollywood Land. The sign said Hollywood Land. It was an advertisement for new houses in the suburbs of Los Angeles. The need for a usable pass. You've got to do something with your history. You've got to make it mean. Ramona helped do that and became, like I said, the creation myth, or at least the primary historical lens, ahistorical lens, through which California viewed itself. And keep in mind that California and Los Angeles especially, Southern California, was new. It was new. The population had come in droves, beginning with the railroads in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But what was this place? What was Los Angeles? Well, it was nothing. It was nothing. I mean, there were fights in the streets all the time. The streets were made of dirt. There was no water on Bunker Hill. Nobody lived on Bunker Hill because there was no water on Bunker Hill. It was a shitty little town. What better move than to say, hey, you know this novel that has sold almost as much as Uncle Tom's Cabin? That's right here. Come see the novel. Come see the novel? Yeah, it worked because we love that shit. We love it. The missions were now viewed as a part of the history of the United States, and Los Angeles and Ramona's land was our Plymouth Rock and our Jamestown. There's also therapeutic advertising. Whose term is this? Roland Marchand. I love reading historians. Here's the quote: "The transforming forces of modernization were affecting Californians in this period, the late 19th and early 20th centuries." I've never read a historian who has not said, now this period of time was a time of dramatic change. You know, you got to keep your business, which is accounting for change. I'd love to read a sentence from a historian who said, nothing interesting happened during this period. Nothing. All right. This was a time of rapid industrialization, urbanization, stratification. For many Americans, these changes were disconcerting, even frightening. And the image of the mission, he says, was invoked as a kind of mediator. I think this is probably right. Connecting the brave new world of modern industrial California with the golden age that went before. In the early 20th century advertisement lies evidence of what historian Roland Marchand has called the therapeutic role of advertising. Therapeutic role of advertising. All right. What's the meaning of Los Angeles and Ramona? Well, you may know of a book called The History of Forgetting by Norman Klein. Great example of the history of forgetting, right? Here's a novel that was written to depict the hardships and suffering of Native people, and so that action would be taken to alleviate that suffering. And in fact, we forgot all about that because we were seduced by the siren song of a golden age. And we will always be seduced by that. I'm sorry that doesn't apply in 2019 or 2016 for that matter, where you're seduced by the promise of a previous golden age again. Dynamic storytelling. So, in oral cultures, cultures without writing, the history of forgetting is fine. It's what you do because life moves on. The only things you remember are things that are still in the stories. Well, those things and those people and those events and sometimes those places fade. This is okay. This is what happens in an oral culture. It's dynamic. It's only when you get to literate culture where you take your story and you make it quite literally an object and you say, oh, there's my story. And you walk away and you come back, there's my story. It gives you the illusion of permanence with your stories. I don't think California, Norman Klein hates that and critiques that, and for good reason, and his point is valid, because people get lost in the forgetting. Whole peoples get lost in the forgetting. At the same time, this is, I think, what makes Los Angeles unique, is that it is a dynamic storytelling city. And so it's not, I don't think, accidental that Steve Martin says in LA Stories, some of these buildings are 20 years old, right? This is the nature of the city. It's turning over quickly. And yes, are there moneyed interests? Is there bad faith involved? There's all that. But at the same time, stories keep rolling. They keep coming. And things are lost and people are lost, but also new things are gained. Meaning and myth. Why do we tell these stories? Why? Why would we be so attached to a novel, a sentimental novel? Because we need meaning. We've got to have meaning. And if we can connect that meaning to our place, when language touches land, place is created. Well, that's some potent and powerful witchery right there. And of course, Aristotle was right in his Poetics long ago when he says we read literature, or for him, see a play, because of the catharsis of pity and fear. And we can argue about what he meant by that, but I think we know. It's much nicer to see something acted out on a stage, being able to identify with it without having to feel the effects of it. That's not a cynical interpretation. That's a real interpretation of literature and drama and now television and film. It's a place to play out possibilities without having to commit yourself to them. That's why I'm a literature professor, because I like exploring these ideas in literature. Right? And then, yeah, sure, I'll explore them in my life too, but first I want to play with them right here, right? Because catharsis of pity and fear, I can identify with Oedipus or whoever and say, oh God, that's terrible what happened to him, all the while knowing it's not happened to me. And of course, the story lives a life of its own. You don't get to control the story. No one does. And in fact, a controlled story isn't a story at all. A story is protean. It's always changing, and every time you try to grab it, it's going to transform into something else. And that's exactly what happened to Ramona, for better and for worse. And now we are, I think, the storytelling capital of the world. I don't think that's an exaggeration, but feel free to argue with me if you like. Thank you for your attention, and yeah. Thank you.